Molt bon dia a tothom. Benvinguts a aquesta jornada.
Morning, everyone, and welcome to this multi-level governance at the heart of the European Union. This morning, we're about to discuss, especially share experiences on how the different levels of the public administrations participate in the decision-making process within the EU. When we talk about different levels of the administration, we mean from states to the smaller, more regional or city halls, etc. And the lower we go in the administration, it may look as though we're getting further from the EU, but we're actually closer and closer to citizens, which is why these administrations ought to play a key role in the decision making, because these decisions affect all citizens. For instance, when we talk about everything having to do with climate change. How do we get everyone to have a voice? We will be presenting several representatives with experiences worth sharing. Before we continue, I'd like to welcome Mr. Gerard Vivas Fernandez, who is the General Director of the Government Institutional Representation in the UE and abroad. Good morning. Good morning, delegates, Secretary General, Director, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to excuse Councilwoman Alsina, who was supposed to be here today, but unfortunately, due to schedule clashes, couldn't be here with us. I would also like, before we get into the matter, thank Palau Macaya for hosting this seminar organized by the Catalan Government of External Affairs and DIPLOCAT. This event is framed under the umbrella of the Conference on the Future of Europe, fostered by the European institutions in a reflection exercise on the state of the Union. Thanks to this format of the participative process, citizens were able to debate and offer possibilities on the path that the European project ought to take mid and long term. From the Catalan government, we also wanted to participate in the process through the campaign Listen Europe, where we wanted to appeal to citizens in our country to express their concerns and expectations and made their voices heard within this European frame for reflection. Between December and February, from our department in the government, we organized 8 roundtables where we discussed about each of the matters in the conference and from each of the regions of Catalonia. In some of these roundtables, such as the one in Vic or Lleida, we already talked about some of the subjects at hand today, such as multi-level governments and green transition. At the beginning of the multi-level governance is somehow specified within the frame of the European treaties through the principles of subsidiarity. And under this principle, the European Union, except for the matters of its exclusive competence, and unless wherever it's more pertinent, all public policy matters always need to come out to the point closest to citizens. In 2009, the Lisbon Treaty included the local and regional dimension when the local authorities are within the possibilities to handle their competence in a more efficient manner than central governments. However, it is too often that the cycle of public policies in Europe doesn't really take into account regional and local authorities. I don't have to remind you that we live in really complex times, and we are only starting to handle coming out of the pandemic, and we already facing a new challenge, the conflict in Ukraine and its impact and ramifications within the Europe and the supply chain within the European Union. And it is precisely at times like this where we've seen that both its member states as well as the European institutions, often because, hurry and other reasons, we start resorting to measures that favor an invasion of competences when it comes to matters and subjects that are often attributed to local authorities. We've seen it when it comes to the attribution of the European funds for the recovery, the next generation funds. As you know, this is a stimulus package, the largest one ever funded in the government. It is born, in our opinion, with an error, a conceptual error, which is that it considers states as their sole speakers, and local and regional authorities have been completely left aside, despite how the governance system in the European Union foresees that these authorities closest to the citizens ought to have a voice, ought to have something to say. This is a decision that's inexplainable and controversial and completely baseless, and which, in our opinion, undermines the transformative measures of these funds, which is why in 2020, the Catalan government started this European Regional Fund with the shared goal of claiming a role in the strategies for cooperation and in the decision-making structures. This initiative has made that over the last few months, we started talking about the challenges faced by that regions face when it comes to implementing new measures. And the preliminary results seem to go along hand in hand with what we were saying, which is that recovery plans, especially in Spain, have not respected subsidiary plans. And it is that central governments are responsible for the application of 70% of these European funds, which is why, from the Catalan government, we still defend and we will keep defending and claiming the role of the closest administration to the citizenship, because that's what the citizens are asking. According to the results on the Eurobarometer late last year, 3 out of 4 Europeans believe that regional governments ought to be consulted on European affairs. The survey placed by the survey studies says that about 60% of citizens in Catalonia believe that the government ought to have a bigger decision-making project when it comes to assigning these recovery funds. The regional committee, they already included in their white book on multi-level governance in 2009, as the rest of the EU policies are applied. Within the current context of green transition, together with digital transition, the twin transitions, as the European Commission is calling them, the green transition, which for years, decades, has been on the European political agenda. And as a matter of fact, the main policy of the Commission is the Green Pact, which establishes by 2030 a reduction of at least 55% of its emissions with regards to 1990, as 40% of renewable energies, and a reduction in the use of energy. By 2050, we're talking about completely green energy, which explains that about a third of these €2 billion, according to the European or the Next Generation funds, are addressed to fund and therefore to fund public policies that foster the European Green Pact. And this is a very ambitious proposal because climate change are an existential threat to the European Union as well as the rest of the world. The scientific community has for too long been warning about the changes that have been taking place, sometimes almost irreversibly. And it is precisely because this phenomenon is the result of human action. It is also in our hands to make this a turning point and put a stop to it. Obviously, Catalonia will, as much as it's in its hand, contribute to these efforts. From Catalonia, we want that this green revolution at the European scale is successful, and that is precisely why we are convinced that we will once more need to mobilize and go hand in hand with local and regional movements. We want to aid central administrations to design coordination structures to implement green policies and foster the growth and guarantee that not one person or territory is left behind. I would like to share a specific example that illustrates these structures, these possible structures. The External Department, we organized the MedCap Days where we talked about the green transition and the new European agenda. And we defended Catalonia's commitment with the progressive establishment of a Mediterranean region within this frame of cohesive politics that fosters a greater recovery between both sides of the Mediterranean at a multi-level governance, and that maximizes that we make the most of the green and digital transitions. And I'm wrapping things up. The challenges for the European Union on this matter are paramount. And the transformation to face them will have to be also paramount. Multi-level governance will be the founding stone within the European framework. Because if the decisions of the EU don't go beyond the European capitals, if we completely disregard the subsidiarity principle, the future of the European project is in jeopardy. I would like to start referring to the conference about the future of Europe in a context set by the advance of populism, the misinformation, the growing mistrust of citizens in their institutions, European and otherwise. We launched this conference, the goal of which is to bring the European project closer to the citizens. What we defend when we want to hammer on multi-level governance is precisely this. Because the principle of subsidiarity is to get closer to citizens, because getting far from citizens is to deepen their disconnect from institutions and jeopardize the European project. Europe must listen. They have to listen to actors such as Catalonia because we have a lot to say and a lot to do. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, senyor Vives. Tenim l'honor també de presentar avui...
Thank you, Mr. Vivas. We also have the honor of presenting Dr. Philip De Lombard, who is the director of the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies, starting in January 2022. He currently worked as a professor and investigator in several universities, and he also participated in research and consulting projects between, for instance, governments of Belgium, Flanders, the United States, the World Bank, and the European Commission. Dr. De Lombard was going to talk to us about how the different levels of governance can work together to tackle the most urgent problems in the European Union.
Dr. Philip De Lombard.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, here in Barcelona, also in Brussels, and virtually through the internet. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to DIPLOCAT and the delegation to the EU. It is indeed my task and also pleasure to give this introductory presentation on the topics of today: multi-level governance, ecological transition, and frame this in the context of the conference on the future of Europe, of which it is part. I'm indeed connected to United Nations University, CRIS, the Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. What we do is basically look at and study and analyze regionalisms worldwide and how different levels of governance interact in a number of policy areas. My presentation is structured as follows, and I think my task is indeed to introduce the concepts, to contextualize the discussion of today and also to provide, let's say, the warm-up for the roundtable, which will follow this presentation. Very briefly, the concepts that we are talking about, especially for the people who are new in these debates, we're talking about multi-level governance. There are a number of definitions, of course, available. This is one, and the policy-creating process in which authority and policy-making influence are shared across multiple levels of government, subnational, national, supranational. I think in addition to the emphasis on the process rather than a state, I think what is important here is that it's not only about multiple levels of government, but also about multiple actors. And that is implied by referring also not only to authority, but also to policy-making influence. So you have these two characteristics there combined. It's a concept emerged in the 1990s already. It's descriptive, it's analytical, it's not necessarily normative. It has variations, but I think today we are rather talking about this type 2 multi-level governance, which emphasizes the complexity and the overlap within those systems. It is obviously a concept that is modeled after the EU, modeled on the EU experience, and therefore emerges the question, as always, is that a concept which is broader, more general? Is it exportable? That's not exactly the topic of today, but it's important also to observe in any case that it's a concept that indeed is traveling and that is also more and more used in other contexts, because even if the EU is a very specific construction, all over the world we see this movement towards more complex governance system where in specific policy areas you see this combination of different levels of authority, different kinds of actors coming together or competing or entering in conflict. That is also possible. It's a dynamic concept in the sense that it has evolved over time, whereas we originally were talking rather in terms of government and levels of government. Now we talk, or we mention this concept of governance. We talk about state and non-state actors, not only state actors. Rather than hierarchy, we emphasize complexity. We are not only referring to public action based on binding rules, strictly following the competencies of the corresponding authorities, but also about public action that is not necessarily based on binding rules. We see more and more that, let's say, in different places, at different levels, public action is taking place in a more activist way, you could say. The modes of governance are widening. And from these vertical and formal interlevel relations, we're moving more and more in the direction of, on the one hand, institutionalized coordination, and then also more informal network type of interactions of different types. Now, with this concept has happened a bit the same as what has happened with the concept of regionalism. So when we move from multi-level government to multi-level governance and from old to new regionalism, what we do basically is, on the one hand, to refine our instruments to look at the reality, change our lenses to look at the reality. I think in history, there has always been participation from non-state actors in public action, and that has always been the case. But now we have the instruments, the conceptual instruments to analyze this, to describe this. So that's one thing. So we have, let's say, improved or made our instruments, analytical instruments, more sophisticated. That's one thing. But at the same time, the reality has also changed. Our target has been moving. It's a moving target, the same with regionalism more broadly. For example, if we refer to these institutionalized forms of coordination, we have seen over the last decades that, for example, in the context of the European Union, there has been an evolution towards different types of interactions, which has sometimes been institutionalized, sometimes de facto. So two things are happening at the same time. The reality is changing, but also the way we look at reality is changing. There are two related concepts, and this one has already been mentioned in the introduction, subsidiarity, which is obviously an important concept in the context of the European Union. That is an older concept than multi-level governance, strictly speaking. It already emerges in the 1970s or even before. In the context of the European Union, it emerges for the first time in the 1980s. And what is interesting, especially in the context of our discussion today, originally its application was restricted to the, let's say, the policy domain of the environment. So that's interesting to observe. But most importantly, obviously, was the inclusion of this principle in the Maastricht Treaty, as you all know. Contrary to the previous concept, this is a normative concept. It gives an indication of what should be done. It gives an indication of at which level of governance and government decisions should be taken in a particular policy area. Also there we have seen some kind of evolution in the concept from, let's say, subsidiarity to cool, or the passive subsidiarity, where we're more thinking of a sort of ex post check on what is decided in Europe, towards what is now called this active subsidiarity, which refers also to the pre-legislative consultation and the possibility of, let's say, local and subnational governments to pronounce themselves before decisions are taken. A third concept which I would like to mention briefly is a more recent concept, is the concept of multi-stakeholderism, because it also overlaps with this concept of multi-level governance. This is a concept that emerges somewhere in the 2000s, at least in the context of public policy, because it has also a meaning in the world of in the management of companies. But let's say in the context of public policy, let's say the 2000s, it's more, it's referring to specific policy areas, and the internet governance is one of those. It refers also to this participation of different types of actors in decision making, state actors, non-state actors, and is relevant also to keep in mind here, because they are certainly overlapping. Okay, let me then, after this brief, let's say, conceptual framing, come to the topic of today, where we try to connect multi-level governance with the ecological transition, and do this in the context of this reflection on the future of Europe, which is taking place at the moment and is in its final stages. As you know, this is a reflection that let's say, that has taken 2 years, with a relatively broad scope, because it was mentioned when the process was started, that it was about areas where the EU has the competence to act, or where the EU action would have been to the benefit of European citizens. So it is a broad reflection. In the joint declaration, there is also a reference to subsidiarity and proportionality, and that this is, in any case, should be kept as important principles. It's obviously still very difficult to say or to know what the outcome will be of this conference, what the impact will be. You probably have the skeptics on the one hand who say, well, this is another conference and a lot of blah, blah, and blah, blah, blah. But I think at the same time, I think it's an interesting exercise, which even if there is no immediate impact, it is, let's say, a machine of ideas that is working, and ideas that then will be picked up without any doubt, not only by the institutions, but also by, let's say, the political actors, movements, parties, and so on. So if you look at the recommendations that are emerging, there are many interesting ideas. And so without any doubt, there will be uptake of some of these ideas. The elephant in the room is probably treaty reform. Is that part of the exercise or not? That is also very difficult to say at this moment. But in any case, it allows us to reflect on the topics of today. On the one hand, the multi-level governance system. How stable is that system? How robust? How coherent? How can we strengthen this? And this is part of the debate. On the other hand, you have the topic of the ecological transition. How central is that policy in Europe? Or how transversal is that? That's part of the reflection. What are the directions that we should take? How should the competences in that area be distributed or redistributed, and so on? And it is an opportunity also to link the two, and the event of today is part of this. I had a look at the recommendations that are now on the table, and that can be consulted online, as you know. In the area of environment, which is connected to health, Panel 3, there are 51 recommendations on the table. If you look at them, you see that the policy instruments that are referred to are varied. In, let's say, 1/3 or even 1/3 of the cases, it is a demand for more or new regulation in some way or another. Another third of these recommendations refers
Una part d'aquestes recomanacions es refereixen a les subvencions, és a dir, la contribució o aportació al flux financer, i després tenim una altra tercera part on tenim informació sobre les activitats que han de ser finançades i també els nous impostos i les noves restriccions a les importacions en la frontera externa de la Unió. Aquests són els temes de polítiques. I la qüestió és si aquests instruments de política són adients per ser implementats a diferents nivells. Amb l'excepció de les restriccions a les importacions, tota la resta de casos podem implementar-los a diferents nivells. I he analitzat les diferents referències.
Should be activated. And what you see there is that when you look at the recommendations in the area of ecological transition, that there's very little reflection on the how. There is a lot on the what. What do we want? We want more eco-taxes. We want more restrictions at the external borders. We want investment in this and investment. But the how question is there is a reference to the EU, and the EU should, but it's not always clear what is meant by the EU. Is it the EU as an institution or a configuration of European institutions? Or is it the EU in its totality with its member states, its citizens? So that is not always clear. So I have the impression that in the reflection and in the debates that have been happening, that very little attention went really to the governance aspects of these new policies that we want for the environment. In just a few cases, there is a reference to the EU and member states, that there is a role for the member states. And only in 4 out of 51, we see a reference to other levels of governance, which in some way speaks to multi-level governance. In other 9 cases, there is no mention at all about which level or how and so on. So it's really striking, and that there are a lot of recommendations, good recommendations in terms of substance, but no reflection at all about the implementation and the governance aspects of this. And these are as important as the content, as you know. There is another panel, which is the panel on European democracy, values and rights, rule of law, security. I also had a look at this panel and the recommendations of this panel to see whether you find the reflection on multi-level governance there. But as there is also reference to the rights of nature, there are a few recommendations referring to ecological transition that are also, let's say, pronounced there, but which are very coinciding with the ones of the other panel. And then in the part on European democracy, there are several recommendations on citizen participation, recommendations about creating digital platforms, for example, how to give citizens a role in the decision-making processes. There is even, or there are even recommendations to in some way institutionalize this through the creation of citizen bodies, bodies of citizens. Only in one recommendation there is a reference to the national and the local levels, but more in the sense of, okay, this citizen participation should be replicated at these other levels, but nothing about the connection between those. Again, multi-level governance is practically absent in this reflection. And of course, when you see proposals that go in the direction of creating new bodies, citizen bodies, you might ask yourself also the question, okay, will that at the end of the day strengthen European democracy or perhaps strengthen it in some way, but perhaps weakening existing bodies? We have bodies at the local and the regional levels already in place. So by creating parallel bodies, you might ask, okay, what will be the net, let's say, gain for democracy in Europe? I don't want to say that these digital platforms are not important. I think they are important and they are the future. And obviously, that is very clear. Where you do find a reflection on the place of multi-level governance in the context of this reflection on the future of Europe is in the contributions from the Committee of the Regions, with whom several of you are very familiar. And there is this study, which for those who do not know the study, I would certainly recommend the study commissioned to the London School of Economics, where you find, let's say, a solid, theoretically and empirically based proposal to strengthen multi-level governance with an argumentation, a solid argumentation why this is needed. Interestingly, they work with several scenarios. I was referring to the elephant in the room, treaty reform. So they work with different scenarios, with or without treaty change. There are, I think, interesting proposals also. For example, this idea of creating these hubs, which are, let's say, levels, communities of more or less similar size in the different countries, which could coincide with existing, I don't know, provinces, departments, etc., in the countries, but where you have this connection between citizen participation and the existing, let's say, structures, institutions that we have. So I think in that sense, that is interesting. Where it becomes more tricky also in this proposal is when you talk about competencies and the distribution of competencies across levels and so on. In the proposal there is there is a statement about, okay, climate policy that is clearly European, so that should be mostly at the European level, even if there are, of course, also specific impacts and local impacts of climate change. In other policy areas, related policy areas, there is, let's say, an argument in favor of, let's say, lowering the level of decision-making and involving lower levels of decision-making, like the common agricultural policy, transport, energy. But when you read this, obviously, you see already the difficulty in speaking in general about which level should be in charge of in which policy area or policy sub area. In most of these areas, it is clear that there is a role for all of these levels, but a different role, but there is a role for all of these levels. If I mention, for example, energy, it's very clear that obviously, well, yes, okay, at the local level, you can take measures to save energy, to help to transit from one source of energy to another, and so on. But there are decisions that have to be taken at the European level, and I think in the current geopolitical context, I think we are very much aware of this. Also, let's say big decisions on nuclear energy, for example, is not something that can be delegated to lower levels, I think. I will not go into the details of their proposals, but I simply invite you to have a look at them if you are not familiar with them. More recently, the Committee of the Regions also published this Marseille Manifesto, which calls for an upgrade of the Committee of the Regions with binding roles in a number of policy areas, also some role in the so-called trialogues, and the former role of the regional parliaments in proposing EU legislation. So this is also now on the table. Concluding remarks, I think it is clear that when we are facing environmental and the climate challenges of today, that this requires public action and public action at all levels. So multi-level governance is de facto there, and but that is public action should be coherent. That's the challenge, I think, to have a coherence at the same time as being participatory, inclusive, and multi-level. We don't know what the outcome and the impact of the conference will be. Will that lead to treaty reform or not? It's not impossible that with the current, let's say, geopolitical situation, that there might be momentum for new initiatives that go in the direction of treaty reform. I don't know. I mean, it's not impossible. I think that at some point there will be momentum to do this. A scenario could also be this scenario of a two-speed EU again, where you have a core where integration is deepened, becomes more political with a military component and so on, and then with around it, let's say an economic space. That is a possibility, but I'm not better placed than you to pronounce myself on this, but it's not impossible. In any case, I think in the short term, I think what we need is a better connection between the substance of these proposals for ecological transition and the governance aspects of implementation, which includes this reflection on the role of multi-level governance in that area, which is now absent in most of the debates. Citizen participation is not the same thing as multi-level governance. These are two different things, but they should be connected. That's the challenge. And obviously, and with this I will finish then, there is an unavoidable trade-off between democratization, participation, localization on the one hand, and then decisiveness, coherence, effectiveness on the other hand. For example, if at the local level you want to make decisions on production methods, shortening value chains, this has automatically an implication for EU's trade policy and what you do at the borders of the EU. So there is always this trade-off, this tension, but that is unavoidable. I'm looking at the watch, and I would like to thank you for your attention, and back to our moderator. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. De Lombard. Thank you for being here and thank you for sticking into time. Comencem ara la taula rodona que hem anomenat governança multinivell.
So now we start with a roundtable discussion that we have entitled Multi-Level Governance. It's time to start working. We introduce the different panel members, most of whom are online. We have Svelina Nacheva, head of the A3 unit, Governance, Plans and Climate Integration from the EU Commission. Gianluca Spinacci, an advisor of the Green Deal of the European Committee of Regions. Gorka Noor, delegate of the Catalonian government in front of the European Union. And Mr. Maastricht Treaty. We have divided up this in two. Each one of the panel members will have between 5 and 7 minutes. And for those of you who are in person, well, and those of you who are online, you can actually give us your questions, and you can actually write them down in the chat box if you so wish. So we will start with the Lisbon Treaty and the subsidiarity principle and multi-level governance when it comes to preparing EU policies. At a time like now, when the EU is talking about a transition towards a green economy, this is becoming very complicated with war in Ukraine. So, the decisions that are being undertaken will affect directly the life of European citizens. And they should all be involved in the competencies in the territories. And all of this has forced us to think about this transition. Multi-level governance is crucial given the international threats for this transition to be successful. And a call is made to European citizens to be present so that they also feel co-producers and co-responsible for this transition. And to respond to this first question, we have Svelina Nacheva, who is the head of the unit A3, Governance, Plans and Climate Integration. You have the floor, Svelina.
Thank you very much. I hope that you can hear me well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well,
so first, yes, I can start. So,
a bit. Ja fa temps que estem immersos en una emergència.
1 second, Svelina, because I wanted to say something else. I mean, the European Commission has many tools and instruments to involve not only the local and regional governments, but also civil society. So how is the European Union doing to have a multi-level governance system that involves different stakeholders when it comes to linking all of this with the transition, the ecological transition? So, 1 second. Now, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. As the other presenters have already said, it's an important debate to have. I think on the EU level, it's very clear to us that the European Green Deal cannot be achieved by the EU institutions or by the member states alone. It's a very transformative agenda. So we have an objective to reach climate neutrality by 2050. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. And this is a very big transformation, modernization of all sectors of the economy. It will have an impact on the everyday lives of all citizens. It needs to take into account, of course, that there will be some who will be more vulnerable to this transition and would need to be supported in it. So based on this, it's very clear that it cannot come into fruition without the mobilization, the support, and then the very active participation across all levels, from citizens to cities and regions and to member states. Today we talk a lot about the regional and local action, and these will be kind of cornerstone for implementing, reaching our goals on renewable energy, on energy efficiency, on adapting to climate change. For example, decisions taken on the planning for local transport, for the insulation of buildings, for deployment of renewables, for training and skills that need to take place for this transition to be successful. All of these need to be decided kind of and implemented at the regional and local level. So overall, our approach to the climate is to take a whole of government approach where we need to involve all the relevant stakeholders. In terms of climate policy, I think we rely a lot on setting at EU level the direction of travel, so defining what kind of targets we need to achieve in order to combat the climate challenge. And all of this, of course, is done through very wide public debates and consultations with various stakeholders. And then at the same time, when we have to implement and reach those targets through specific policies on the ground, we have some which are done at EU level, for example, CO2 standards for cars. So these are kind of policies that benefit from the internal market and are more cost efficient to be done at EU level. But there's also, of course, a lot of sectors where member state action is what is needed to achieve the emission reductions. So for some sectors such as agriculture, buildings, road transport, we set targets for the member states themselves, and then through planning they have to decide exactly how they have the flexibility to see what kind of policies and measures they have to implement in order to contribute to this EU-wide effort. In terms of concrete involvement, I think, of course, in the development of the legislation, as I mentioned, we do a lot of stakeholder consultations. We talk to the member states, to the European Parliament as co-legislators. Of course, organizations such as Committee of the Regions and the European Economic and Social Committee bring the local communities and civil society into the decision-making here in Brussels. In terms of climate, of course, it's not only about the policies and measures and regulations of how to achieve the actual investments on the ground. We also use the EU budget to make sure that these kinds of investments take place. And I think here the role of the regional and local action is very important. So, for example, we work with the regions on the development of the programs that are done under the European Structural and Investments Funds. And these are, at least for us, kind of key instruments that we see the needed and necessary investments to take place. In terms of cities and kind of the local level, we also have initiatives such as the Government of Mayors, whereby local authorities make their local commitments and take local action, and they explain how exactly they will contribute to the EU-wide efforts of reducing emissions by at least 55% by 2030. Under Horizon Europe, so this is kind of the research funds in the EU, we have also started a very innovative approach, whereas the so-called missions are created, where some societal challenges have to be addressed. And we have on the climate side, for example, a mission on adaptation, so how to adapt to the effects of climate change, which are at this stage inevitable. And in order to kind of develop how these missions take place, we have worked very closely with the regional and local level, because the types of solutions that need to be deployed, like new technologies, experimenting with new solutions that are adapted to the local needs, engaging with different stakeholders towards the green transition, all of these things have to take place at the regional level. So we have cooperated very well with regions so far, and we hope that they will continue to be involved in the implementation stages. And I think this kind of brings me also to the last level of governance, which is the citizens. And I think it's very clear to everyone that the race to climate neutrality will never be won if we don't manage to get the citizens on board. In terms of how we reach out to citizens, of course, we have outreach activities and campaigns. I think this conference today, in the context of the Conference of the Future of Europe, is one such example. But under the European Green Deal, we have also created a new awareness-raising instrument in this context, the so-called European Climate Pact. It was launched in 2020, and it gives a platform and supports co-creation of individual actors in their climate-related efforts. It encourages individuals and organizations to take climate-related pledges. It invites them to organize different discussions in their communities and to act as Climate Pact ambassadors. And we're seeing kind of a lot of engagement from individuals, but we are also happy that a lot of regions and cities are also involved. And I think here the important thing is that, of course, the regions and cities should make their own pledges and contribute to the joint efforts, but they also have a very key role to play in mobilizing their own citizens to participate in such initiatives, because, of course, they're closer to the citizens in their communities. So I think I will leave it here at the moment and looking forward to the debate. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Macheva. Continuem ara amb el...
So, let's continue with the next speaker, Maciej Sitek. He is actually a member of the Polish Region Assembly.
Because we know that you're in a bit of a hurry. So I don't know if you're here.
Jestem. Dzień dobry.
Yeah, we're hearing you, but we're not actually, now we're seeing you. Okay, so we're going to be addressing you both questions in the same time. We know you're in a bit of a hurry, so thank you for our invitation. Wielkopolska és una de les regions de Polònia que més fortament està apostant cap a la transició verda de la seva economia.
I mean, you actually are in one of the regions that is working fastest on the green transition.
So first question, it's going to be, en comparació amb altres regions carboníferes de la Unió Europea,
comparing with other agents, you have defined a very ambitious plan. What are the elements that you would highlight for this process to be successful with regards to the public authorities, with regards to this transition? Well, good morning, everybody. I am so happy to be able to participate in this meeting and to represent Poland in this conference. We do have some very ambitious plans, one of which is to reach our goals by the year 2030, a reduction of CO2 emissions. And another part of the plan is in 2040, in which in the sub-region we would like to reach a climate neutrality level. This is a very ambitious plan, to be honest. However, it is clear, and we do have some very good tools prepared for this process. And what I believe is even more important in this case, what's most important for the success of our actions is social citizens' participation. We have tried to involve in the process all significant participants in the region, all of the significant elements involved. one of which are the regional governments and also companies. Everybody should be involved. Everybody should actually bear in mind this challenge. What we believe is very important indeed is that everyone should work together and everyone should actually leave a space for the others. Because this mutual understanding and this action, which is actually wants to take our region to a climate neutrality level, is very complex. Very complex indeed. But it is here where opinion leaders should play their role. Influential people are the people who influence society are key actors in this endeavor. What's most important is that citizens themselves who may not be interested by these topics should also be involved. It is very important to raise awareness and encourage them to participate. This is what I call the construction of a new regional identity. What do I mean by that? I mean that not only some jobs will be substituted by others, which is interesting in itself, but the process is much more complicated because we can imagine that, of course, miners, for example, will change their skills and qualifications, or they will need to do so. And this sometimes, well, I like to joke that we will teach them to be flower keepers, but that's just a joke because it's not true. I mean, this implies building up a new identity. I mean, to leave the coal industry and to abandon the coal industry is closely related to changing your identity. It's not only about jobs, it is also feeling that you're an important part in the jigsaw puzzle of building up your country. I'm a significant member of society. It's not just about making money. This is very important. We have decided, and we want to keep on being an energy producing region. And we have created other things. But jobs need to be replaced by other parts of society. So with regards to, we're thinking about production, we're thinking about, mobility based on electricity, and also the creation of factories and jobs where people will be able to work. And not only work, but at the same time, they should feel good and comfortable with their jobs, with their new jobs. Another very significant element are technologies. Modern technologies that so far we had no access to. One of the most important factories will be the production of hydrogen, which will be a good fuel for buses. And this change will happen at different levels. It should not only be about assuring new jobs. It's not only about that. We should also fulfill other conditions, not only job creation, but also we should give support to local government. And over there, we will have a loss of taxes that used to come from the mining industry, and that will need to be compensated by something else. Other elements, like changes related to transport, which should also be an ecological type of transport. Other changes related to the energy efficiency of buildings. That's another gigantic challenge. And here we also have to see, it is also related to this multi-level in Poland. But we also see that our challenges also include other mining regions. And we see a very large participation of investors and business people. On the other hand, we are also offering something new to citizens and to the regional inhabitants. We should make them feel that they will still be a very significant part, a very significant factor for the country. And they should be able to keep on building up their future, because without a clear plan for the region, that change will be made much more difficult. It's very important to have a vision and to have a positive vision as opposed to having a lot of money, because there are other regions who used to have a lot of money and yet they have not produced the results that were expected from them at the EU level.
In his intervention, he said that he gave
We
a lot
have
of
to-
attention to social stakeholders. Do you consider that this process could be taken away without
Okay,
application,
what are the
application of
implications of the
multi-level
multi-level
governance?
governance?
Absolutnie nie. To właśnie samorządy i lokalna społeczność
Without the possibility
gmin, powiatów, województwa zdecydowała o tym procesie.
of this multi-level governance, this change could not take place. It goes a little bit counter to what the central government was expecting,
To także wiąże się z tym,
which tends to concentrate more on the carbon matters. And it also has a lot to do with the fact that the central government always would rather have something, because we're a very small mining region. Śląsk is a much bigger region. And so it has made us participate in all the meetings with the European Commission, as well as the creation of international plans. We, as a small region, and also with the World Bank, we are continuously learning from others. And at the same time, we do have a certain freedom to operate because we're independent from the government in our region, and that allows us to make our own decisions. I always say that Warsaw has no idea of what goes on in the small places in Wielkopolska. We are the ones who know what's going on. And that is why it's important that we keep a certain freedom to act, and that the funding system is built in such a way that we can use it ourselves and make decisions on it, just as it was said earlier on the fair transition. It's the local governments who really decide on how to put these tools into operation. And I believe that what we do in a moment like this, beyond the transformation plans that we have already submitted to Brussels, is also the construction for the strategy on East Wielkopolska, which is going to be a sub-regional development, which above all will give importance to the local governments to create a government at different levels, so that everyone knows where they can go and what we can achieve. We believe, from our point of view, this government, this multi-level government, is still too small, because it's precisely the tool that gives us the feeling that we can implement this process, and that this process is close to the citizenship, as has been said here in the beginning. And this nearness establishes trust. I direct a region, the capital of which is Poznan, but I come from a small city called Ponin, and that's where we need to be, together with the people, close to the citizens, where we need to constantly explain why it is so important to do things this way. Participation and a new identity, these are all elements that allow us to be successful. And obviously, we will actually be seeing this in the future. A few years from now, we'll be seeing if this works, but we trust and we believe that we have constructed a certain process that's going to be very difficult to stop. Perhaps before 2030, we will have tied this process to carbon because all these economic processes are now flourishing really quickly. And what we really care about is that our observations at the local level are taken into account so we can transfer them in meetings such as today's event, because we want everyone to know that the Wielkopolska region is working within the European framework and within the European Commission. And this all ties into with us having the possibility of participating independently from the central government and independently from central decisions. We can convey our observations directly, and that's what I think our participation here today is incredibly important, because that is what is allowing us to share this information. All these mining regions within the EU are transforming themselves, and our experiences may help other regions, other mining regions to transform. And I think the success of this transformation process is really important for the future of the Green Deal, because our processes will allow the European Union to reach its goals. And one last thing, all regions need to sometimes swim against the current. In our country, people used to think that the transformation plan ought to be one single central plan across the whole country, and that the government in Warsaw ought to make all the decisions. And we have gone against that notion, and I believe that we have been successful because the institutions that are governing this process, it's really the regional governments. And we are an institution that is where it needs to be to get things going. And I firmly believe that this is a way that is working and that it ought to be fostered within the European Union, because the European Union becomes democratic through regions and not just through central governments. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maciej Stek, for being here. We know you have to leave, so thank you so much for your time. As we were saying, we're sharing experiences. Our next speaker is Gianluca Spinacci, advisor to the Green Deal of the European region, where there's an influx of new legislation already underway and funding, such as the legislative package Fit for 55, as well as funding through the recovery funds and the new programs, new budgetary programs between 2021 and 2027. Mr. Spinacci, which initiatives did the European Region Committee to ensure that local and regional authorities are real partners at the European level of this great continental shift towards carbon neutrality?
Buen día. Gracias por la teva amable invitación. Salutaciones als amics del public.
Good morning, and thank you for your kind invitation, and greetings to the members of the audience.
I will continue in English. I hope you can hear me correctly and well. Before illustrating you what we are doing and what we plan to do at the Committee of the Regions, I would like shortly to react to the previous speakers, starting from our Polish colleague Maciej. I think what he illustrated is very interesting. The just transition mechanisms found in regions, we can assume that is recovering the true spirit of regional policy. We have lived through a period where regional policy has been thought mainly as a financial transfer mechanism. I'm speaking about the last 15, 20 years, which is also important as solidarity instruments. But if we remember how it was born and the experiments launched by Jacques Delors, the integrated plan for the Mediterranean with regions and not only member states, with specific projects and programs on fisheries and agriculture. If we remember the community initiative programs of the late 80s and 90s for the reconversion of the steel industry, for the reconversion of the textile industry. Well, that was a regional policy which was working with the regions, with a group of regions that had the same problems across Europe, with the services of the Commission, and with money, ideas, and networking. I think we are coming back to this principle. The Just Transition Fund mechanism and regions is one example. The other have been mentioned by our colleague Svetlana, whom I would like to express all our gratitude and thanking for the work done in the Commission, in the different services, and for the initiatives she enunciated and goes also in this same direction for the European Green Deal. I will come to this point in 1 minute, but let me also take this opportunity to comment on what Philip very brilliantly and very comprehensively illustrated us about the state of multi-level governance and the perspective in the Conference of the Future of Europe and its follow-up. I take this liberty because having served the Committee of the Region for the last almost 20 years, I had the possibility to put some ink on the paper, both of the White Book on Multi-Level Governance 2008, the latest report jointly with the Commission on the active subsidiarity in 2018, and in these days, I'm part of the team working behind our delegation in the Conference Future of Europe. I fully subscribe to what you said, and I would like also to animate our debate to propose you some further elements of reflection. The first is that traditionally, we have spent a lot of time on both the concept of subsidiarity and multi-level governance in the context of the legislative process. This is still important. However, the nature of the Union is changing. Under the crisis pressure, the executive action of the Union, both as a European institution and as a collection of member states, is becoming more and more important. So in the future conception of multi-level governance, we will have to tackle this question. How, in reply to crisis, as COVID and as the current one with the war, is not, let's say, only a closed room, command room, let's say, of heads of state and government, but also larger governance mechanism involving cities and regions addressing this crisis. And we see how important it is. We have seen with the sanitary crisis, and we are seeing now with the refugee crisis. We can't just have a commando room without the cities and regions. The second element, it relates in reality to the legislative process. And whereas the Conference of Future of Europe has opened up two elements very interesting on participatory democracy and what Philippe called multi-stakeholderism, in reality, we know that there is an institutional agenda behind it, and some points are very clear, and they are progressing quicker than the Conference of Future of Europe itself. The Parliament has already, let's say, voted or is voting now for the mechanism of transnational list. And there will be a further pressure on, even without treaty change, giving de facto a right of initiative, legislative initiative to the Parliament, with some elements in the interinstitutional agreements between the three institutions, even without treaty changes. And I think that we have to reflect on these two elements and how the cities and regions and the citizens will have a say and will have, let's say, participation in these two mechanisms, both of the transnational list and of a right of initiative that is shifting as trend towards the European Parliament. The third element, and it was mentioned also by Philippe, is the world is changing. So he mentioned the platform, social, and I think this is something which was not in the initial analysis of subsidiarity and, let's say, multi-level governance. But networks nowadays, platform, and we see with the conference future itself, are a substantial and, let's say, identity part of the new way of interacting between different levels of governance and stakeholders, starting from the citizens. So we cannot, let's say, leave this point as an anecdote, as, let's say, an element which is accessory. It's part of the core concept of the future of multi-level governance. The other element is global. And now we come closer to the question of the day, I mean, environment and climate. If you think about the last few years, and you think about one movement, which is global, it's about climate. And it's about civic participations, Fridays for Future and other movements. And it's about how also city diplomacy. I can give you a concrete examples of the Committee of the Regions already 12 years ago. The Obama administration was stuck in this climate policy, and we were called by the State Department, because the legislation couldn't go through the Congress, to actively cooperate with the city and with the state of the United States to move forward the climate agenda on the ground of the states, even if in Capitol Hill things were stuck. And I think this will continue. Geopolitical, let's say, polarization that we experiment in these days will even increase more the needs of these city and regions global diplomacy in questions related to environment and climate. I apologize if I diverted a bit by the question which I was asked to answer, and now I will try to answer the question, hoping that the first part solicited a bit of interest for the debate. So your question, I will start from the numbers. So the numbers are the following and are debated tomorrow in the plenary of the Parliament. The Green Deal in 5 years, between 2019 and 2024, is about 500 acts at European level, legislative, regulatory, of different type. 500 pieces of, let's say, rules coming from Brussels to the citizens at the end, to the small and medium enterprise. So how can you dare to think that this can fly without involving and putting at the center those who knows better how this piece of legislation can work? That's the basic question that I think it's in the mind of everybody. The second question is that when we speak about environment and climate, we speak about challenges and solutions which are cross-border. Myself, I come from a region bordering the Adriatic Basin. And I have a long-standing experience of cooperation with the Western Balkans and with the Central Eastern Europe. How can you solve the challenges of environmental and climate, let's say, nature in a sea basin, where on one side you have regionalized states like Italy, and the other side you have centralized states like Slovenia and Croatia or Albania? How can you have a serious climate adaptation plan on the Alpine arc, where on one side you have Austria, Germany, and Italy, which are regionalized and federalized, and the other side, and Switzerland, and the other side you have Slovenia, who is centralized, France, who is rather centralized. And I wouldn't speak about, let's say, the situation on the Mediterranean side between the north and the south. So also there is an evident need to work across levels of governance. Now, you ask what the Committee of the Region is doing. I would reply with 3 axes. The first is our very nature from the treaty. The treaty gives the Committee of the Regions a role as consultative body, as assembly of local regional authorities. And this is the starting point. We have to participate, as Philip said, to the improvement of the legislation in an active way. It's not anymore, let's say, the ex post subsidiarity. This is active subsidiarity. We have to improve legislation even before it is conceived. We have to work on territorial impact assessment, ex ante. We have to follow implementation. We have to evaluate ex post and review and propose improvements. And that's what we have been evolving year over year, and the colleagues working closely with the Committee of the Regions. And I think that Generalitat Catalonia is one of the closest allies of the Committee of the Regions, both in Barcelona and in Brussels, have experienced this. Our toolbox has increased, and also the availability of the Commission and the Parliament and the Council to work with us has changed. So this is the first way we are addressing the question of the 500 pieces of European legislation, the Green Deal, and how to involve local and regional authorities. Concretely, we have set up an initiative which is called the Green Deal Going Local, and allows us to put together the work of the 6 thematic commissions, because the topic is so, let's say, horizontal, is so beyond the silos, that we need to work together between the Commission working on transport, the Commission on energy, and the Commission on social affairs for social justice, climate social justice, and so on and so forth, agriculture. So this is a new instrument that was set up with the current mandate. It works pretty well because it allows us a lot of interchange between the rapporteurs and the Commission on cross-fertilization of topics, and to arrive to the plenary with more consistent position. The second is mobilization. So we have launched a campaign, which is called also Green Deal Going Local. And the campaign build up on the members, both the full and the alternate members. And through the campaign, we are mobilizing around the question of renewables, or energy efficiency, renovation of buildings, greening of cities. Planting of trees and greening of cities is very important as climate adaptation measures. And clearly we are teaming up with the existing instruments like the Green City Accord, the Covenant of Mayors, the missions that Celina just referred to us. I would like also to say what we have proposed to, we haven't achieved yet, because we have to also to be, let's say, fair to ourselves and to our stakeholders. We have asked, for example, to have a European regional scoreboard on the Green Deal. There is a very, let's say, serious lack of data aggregated and disaggregated at NAS2 level, even below, about a lot of the dimension of the Green Deal. If you go to Eurostat, on the main page, I think last week was presented the first, let's say, portal on the data of the Green Deal, and you will see that they are all at European national level. If we want to tackle the question that Maciej reminded us, well, we need to represent these differences. We need a scoreboard at regional level on the Green Deal. And we ask this to work together with Eurostat, with the Commission to deliver it. We also think that, let's say, the Conference Future of Europe should produce, let's say, very concrete follow-up. And here I think that the fact that a lot is on what, on the recommendation, and not so much on how, it's even correct. Because the citizens' press wishes. Now is about the institution to find a common understanding how they can fulfill these wishes and how we can deliver together. Personally, I think, for example, that elements of activation of citizens through education, environmental education, climate education are very important, and will have a major part in the follow-up of the conference. I think also that we need to look abroad, outside the European Union, to see what works well. In California, they launched a very interesting scheme, which is called the Civilian Climate Corps. And it goes back to the experience of the Roosevelt plan, the recovery plan of Roosevelt in the 30s, where basically they ask volunteers to activate and to take care of the territory, to take those actions in the forestry, in the river, in their own cities, which protect the environment and give resilience to climate adverse event. And this is something we don't have in Europe, but we could. And why not? I mean, taking experience which is well working somewhere else. I conclude with an element of perspective, and maybe there could be, let's say, follow-up question on this because of the current energy crisis. The element of perspective is that as in the 80s, following the oil shock, one of the response was the creation, de facto, of the elements of the economic and monetary union. My reading is that what we are creating nowadays and the years to come is a climate and energy union. We can't have common climate targets by the same deadline, having different starting point, having different energy mix, and not having sufficient solidarity mechanism. The Commission, in October last year, evaluated that the additional to the recovery plans, additional to the cohesion funds, additional to all what we have already in place, investment per year needed to achieve the energy and climate transition that we wish to achieve by 2030. I'm speaking about in 8 years' time, the fifth of 55. The additional investment per year is around 390 billion euro. This is something that no member states can do alone. And it would be even unfair to do alone, because the strongest could be quicker and better, and the weaker won't. And so we have to seriously ask what we need for this climate energy union, which governance mechanism, which solidarity mechanism, and which is the role of local and regional authorities. It was mentioned in Next Generation EU. Next Generation EU is about 100 billion euro of investments per year, 37% climate and energy. So about 40 billion euro per year of investment in this sector. Currently, we pay to Russia almost 1 billion euro, oil, gas, and coal per day. So over a year, we pay to Russia 6 times what we invest in renewable energy efficiency and climate-related measures in Next Generation EU. This is something that we cannot change overnight. It will be a process, but this process needs to be started, needs to be accelerated, and to be accelerated, regions and cities needs to be on board, because the permitting, for example, for solar, or the identification of fast-track go-to areas for a wind park, this is something that is not only in the hands of the member states, it's also in the hands of the regions. And all the questions related to energy efficiency, and I would add energy austerity and savings. We are reading to this. We are reading to energy savings and austerity is in the hands of local communities. And I very much congratulate the Catalonia regional government, because you have already a very interesting set of programs and projects. I would just like to mention among those that have been signaled to me, the one on the energy communities, because we need this. We need more and more of this. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to come out of the current crisis. Thank you so much, and I'm available for the debate. I apologize if I was a bit long.
Thank you, Mr. Spinacci, for your insights and for your kind words in Catalan before. We'll come back to you shortly. L'últim dels convidats que tenim aquí presencialment, és en Gorka Knör.
One of our guests here today is Gorka Knör, who is a representative of the Catalan government before the European Union. Catalonia has been working to foster and lead the green transition. And this is actually one of the centers that have been explained and expressed in the open plan, this legislation. So could you give us some examples of the application of this multi-level governance? Good morning, Professor, and good morning to the rest of the participants. Before we move on to the question, I had prepared my words, but after hearing everyone else, I completely changed it around. Because I think it might be best to just write an article on what I was going to say, because after everything I've heard, I feel the need to say, to talk about the things that we're seeing on the ground. I was talking about what I was seeing here lately and trying to find an image to talk about multi-level governance. And the first thing that came into my mind was the Scottish legend of Loch Ness, because it's something that everyone talks about, but no one has ever seen the monster. So when we talk about multi-level governance, it's something that we talk about a lot, but we practice rather little. And I was quite startled by what some of Philippe's conclusions, where multi-level governance isn't really talked about. And I don't know if that one of the reasons might have been how the debate has been set up, because the Spanish state wanted to organize a debate on the future of Europe, and Catalonia chose to have its own debate with its different regions, and it organized debates and roundtables in different places with visiting professors and visiting experts, and they presented their own conclusions. And there we see a very direct worry about everything that you said. So this might be one of the reasons. I mean, going back to reality, what we find is that there are some participation mechanisms, quote unquote, at the Spanish state levels, but at the end of the day, their use is rather limited. And I'm just going to quote verbatim the President von der Leyen a few days ago in Brussels. Before the participants of the Aid Cohesion Forum,
local stakeholders, mayors and regional administrators, they know best what citizens need and on the ground. So we should put them even more into the center of our decision maker and involve them at every step from drafting regional and national plans to their implementation on the ground. Bueno, es exactamente, bueno, no
So that's exactly, I mean, this is exactly the opposite of what's going on. We have very little participation. The elements that were introduced in 2004 in Spain, you know, for the building up of an opinion, and also the participation in the different ministers' councils. And what has happened after the pandemic is that they have actually got rid of that meeting even. Well, this is what's happening. And I think there is here a double contradiction. On the one hand, we have the Green Deal, the European program for the Green Compact, and in which there is very little involvement on the side of territorial authorities, and we have the program of the Next Generation Cooperation Fund. And here, you know, Ursula von der Leyen, between what she says and what's happening, there is a big difference, and the gap is widening. For example, I really loved Gianluca's presentation and also the Commission's representative. I mean, the goals cannot be attained by the EU on its own. And I have understood that you're happy with our participation at a local level. But the Spanish recovery plan was presented to Brussels without any previous consultation with the local authorities, no consultation with the local authorities whatsoever. Paradoxically, when the Commission approved the plan, in the text it says it has been consulted with the local authorities and the National Board of Youth. Well, it is in writing, but it is not true. It never happened. And the permanent Spanish representative in Brussels, when I asked him, he said exactly, literally the following: we are not the ones, we are not the only ones who have not consulted. We are not the only ones who have not consulted, he answered me. So this is happening. And I think it's very hard to reach your goals if you don't bear in mind that if you do not take into account the local authorities, and if in addition to it all, the local authorities are not taken into account when it comes to defining the policies. So my feeling is that, well, none of this is happening. None of the programs that are being applied by the Spanish government for Next Generation Europe have been consulted. They are all programs that have come from the External Affairs Ministry. It has not been consulted with anybody. And this implies that sometimes we find plans that come already made from the top. They have a final scope and they assign money, and they have nothing to do with our real needs. The representative from the Commission knows that Catalonia carried out its homework many months before. there was the report about the recovery funds. And Catalonia presented up to 27 driving projects in the field of the natural environment, and none of them have been taken into account by the Spanish authorities. This is what's happening. So it is very hard to think that we will reach the goals in an adequate way. Very, very ambitious goals for the green transition. They will never be reached if the local authorities are not taken into account. And this is what's actually happening. There's a big gap between the official speech and what's going on in the field. And I am in close relationship with Mr. Spinacci. And historically, we have convened that the role played by the Committee of Regions is a very important one. Right now, there is a very big unsatisfaction on the side of the regions at a European level. And many regions are very unhappy about how the recovery funds are working. And they are raising their voice. And they are collecting their voices to go to the Committee of Regions, to go to the European Parliament and go beyond. And to say, we are here. We want to participate. We agree with the goals. But sorry, but we are not participating. And let me just give you one example. Probably Gianluca Spinacci knows about the initiative action that's also being carried out at the Committee of Regions on the car manufacturing industry and the package devoted to it. There are very intensive European packages, not only with manufacturing, but also with supply part. And they are trying to analyze how the European plan will be implemented. Now that there is, after a health crisis and an economic crisis. So they're also meeting at a regional level and at a Committee of Regions level to make their voices be heard. And the message is very clear. We agree with the goals, but we want to be heard. We want to speak up and be heard. We want to decide how to implement all of this. We want to make our voice heard by the European Commission in order to make its mechanisms more flexible and adaptable to the situation. It is not acceptable that right now European manufacturers who have to make an enormous transformation in order to manufacture things in a very different way, with totally different processes compared to the ones we had beforehand, and all of what that implies in the value chain. I mean, it is not acceptable that right now the response by the European Commission is, okay, you are a manufacturer, you will keep on being the same manufacturer, and your investment will not benefit from European subsidies. That needs to change. That's not just one example. I believe that the regions have given enough examples about our efficiency to share the good experiences we have had so far. At some point, I worked in the Basque Country, and over there we saw how certain crucial environmental issues were carried out and how the government participated, and how small municipal entities and different NGOs and civil society associations participated. And they all work together in a joint governance, all of it within the regional context. In Catalonia, we have paradoxical examples, like the case of the co-management, the Maritime Co-Management Board. These are good examples of how, if the different governance levels are taken into account, things can be done efficiently. But we find ourselves in a situation, Mr. Spinacci knows about this, Gianluca, we find ourselves in a situation in which, at a regional level, between in inverted commas, because we would rather be called national levels, Catalonia and the Basque Country are two nations, well, we find ourselves in a situation with regards to the natural environment in which only Madrid acts with regards to the climate change. Catalonia has been pioneering from the point of view of climate change. But the central government opposes it with the argument that they need to wait for the whole state of Spain to act. And I have to add something else to that. We need to share not only experiences, but we must change the dynamics. You know, the fact that the regional data are not integrated. We need to know what's going on the field. I know I have spoken about many things here, but I just wanted to say very clearly that we want to be there, we want to participate, we want to keep on being fully involved in this European-wide challenge. But the central government does not allow us to do that. This is evident, and it cannot happen. It is happening with the cooperation funds as well. Right now, Catalonia is affected by a gap, a funding gap that will also affect the natural environment. In 2021, Catalonia, which accounts for 19% of the Spanish GDP and 16% of its population, has only received 7% of the funds. Catalonia, which is pioneering as well in other fields, finds that the central government gets the next generation funds, and then it actually assigns them centrally, and it assigns it to the rest. This is a type of dynamics that should change, because many things will be done. But at the end of the day, companies continue, businesses adapt to the calls, but we will not be doing things as efficiently as possible. Things will be done with an outlook and with a vision that is not really closely tied to reality, with a central government's view that's not adapted to a regional vision. So I'm going to stop here. If you wish, afterwards we can actually analyze this in greater depth. We will come back to you later, because I'm going to ask you a number of questions in order. I'd like to highlight that, well, we have a conference format, so we will actually listen to each of the speakers in turn. So let's start with a Q&A, the structured Q&A session in the following way. Maybe you should tell us what the EU could do about this situation to allow the local level to have a greater voice. Well, the EU should go from words to facts. I have quoted President von der Leyen because I fully agree with what she said a fortnight ago in Brussels. The problem is that it is not actually verified by facts. So there should be, they should listen more carefully to the voice of the regions. We have the possibility to cooperate in regional networks. We have the possibility to go to the European desks and present our views. But through the central governments, this is not possible. And we could say, for example, what the situation in Belgium is, what we have seen with regards to the next generation funds, that they work in a satisfactory way. In Germany and in Austria, they have regulated by law the regional presence and their opinion. So the decision-making process is well defined. But in our case, the EU should be well aware. At the end of the day, the EU is actually shooting itself on the foot. If the policies are not consistent with the regional needs, this will not only hurt Catalonia or Galicia, Extremadura, or the Basque Country. It will not serve the whole of the Union. It will hurt the whole of the Union. For example, the EU, although it is reactive, it does not react to a European directive published in 2020, transposed 2 years later in Spain, and 2 years later it is not being complied with. Spain is paying after more than 60 days, and that's illegal. Spain, as of today, large listed companies in the IBEX index list, they owe more than 80 billion euro to SMEs in Spain. And that's just a scandal. It is much more than what will come in terms of subsidies to Spain. The first measure the EU should undertake for everything, for the transition, for everything, is that these large listed companies pay the SMEs. And they do nothing about it. And like that, so many other things. I mean, the EU is very far from what's happening on the ground in national realities. There are many people who are moving at a European level, who are networking in the Committee of Regions, who have also been working in a very proactive way, compared, the regional voices is being heard again. And this is going to be big. Once for all, we will have to go from words to actions and facts. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Golkanda. Now we will give the floor to Gianluca Spinacci. Let's talk about energy. Energy has been important for a long time, given the prices, its effects on climate change, and we're seeing how it is becoming even more important. And how should cooperation from the point of view of energy be at a European level? My question is, the Committee of Regions and the regions do they know how to deal with this problem? Gianluca, give us the regional view.
Sí. Muchas gracias al
Thank you.
señor.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Golkanda.
I would like to take the provocation on the PNR, on the recovery plans, which is not a provocation, is reality, with two concrete examples, how it works with the national scheme and with the regional one. And I will try to answer to this question on the energy. So in Italy, for energy efficiency, we have a scheme managed at national level. It's called, and it's very famous because it's called 110%. So basically, you do renovation works for 100 euro and you receive 110. However, to cash in before, you sell the credit to the bank and you receive 95. So 15 goes to the banks. There is no discrimination in terms of social income. You can have 2 villas, 2 big houses, or 1 small apartment and 5 children. You take 110%, minus 15% for the banks. So tell me if at the end of this process, you have achieved climate social justice. Tell me if the citizens, at the end of this process, they would have perceived a Europe that is fair. At the same time, I'm renovating my private house here in Belgium. And in Belgium, as it was mentioned, the recovery plans is regionalized. And I'm applying for renovation funds managed by the region of Brussels. And the same is in Flanders and the same is in Wallonia. The system is very different. The system is discriminatory in terms of income. It's managed directly by the city or the region. And that's the other important elements. You present a project and you are required to adhere to certain elements which are consistent with a plan, city and regional climate plan and architectural renovation plan. So with the same intervention, you don't just put insulation on the roof and you are not asked about what you're doing of your house and your quartier and your city, but you are part of a broader renovation project, urban renovation projects, which has to comply with certain, let's say, requirements. That's the difference between a national recovery plans, which is managed centrally, and it's more, let's say, friendly to some important powers, economic powers, central economic powers, and a plan which is closer to the citizens. And I think this is something we have to look after very carefully. The more we go into the direction of strategic autonomy, and we know who is taking care of this dossier in the college, the more we have to look both to the global dimension and the local one. If we reshore our value chain, if we reorganize the industries, we can't simply do with the CEO of the big corporations. We can't do. We need to involve in these projects the regions, the cities, the local, but really, not just with a speech. And I'm not seeing this. And that's why the Committee of the Regions took the initiative on the automotive industry. It's a concrete case, but there are many others. We can speak about the chips, we can speak about health, many other technologies that we are trying to reshore and to become, let's say, strategically autonomous. About the crisis in Ukraine, clearly you know that there is a European plan in the making, REPower. There are two very different components. One is the short term, how we survive. Also there will be elements which have local dimension. For example, let's say all the elements related to infrastructure for diversification, which could be not only for gas, but also already in perspective used also for hydrogen. And there as well, it needs the member states work with the local authorities, because if you have to build a liquid natural gas terminal, I hope that you discuss with the territory where this is going to be. I spoke before about energy saving and energy austerity. I think this will come. And we see already signal in some member states. And clearly this can be done with role modeling at local level. And then there is more the medium long term. How do we shift from fossil fuels? Because we have two dependencies. One is Russia, but the other one is fossil fuels. Even without Russia, we are dependent from fossil fuels. And it's not simply to shift from Russia to shale gas from the US or from Qatar that we will solve the problem. And on this as well, I think there is a very serious need to have not just ministerial meeting with the energy ministers, but as our Catalan friends reminded, we have to reopen these rooms. They are crisis rooms nowadays, understandably, but they cannot be crisis rooms forever. If we have to set a new plan with what the Commission called front-loading Fit for 55, basically achieving higher targets by 2030 or achieving the same targets by 2027, well, this you can't do just with the crisis room of energy ministers. You have really to open the doors and to speak and to involve the local regional decision makers on renewables, on energy efficiency, and many other things, including the funding.
Thank you, Mr. Spinacci. Tornem a Txetxelina Natxeva, recordem és la cap d'unitat adjunta de la unitat A3, governança, plans i corrent
So
climàtic.
we go now to Zvelina again. Mrs. Nacheva, do you believe that an increase in the role of the local authorities will imply greater efficiency for the general governance?
Thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief. So on the planning side, I think we're talking a lot about plans today, also including the previous speakers. And in the field of climate change, this is kind of an innovation that was created, that member states have to create national energy and climate plans, which are helping to see whether we are on track to reach our ambitions. It's helping them to plan different policies and measures, and also to explain the types of investment that would be necessary to achieve those goals. This is all done under the framework of the governance regulation at EU level. And I think in there, one of the key elements is also that we have mandated member states to engage in multi-level climate and energy dialogues, also including the regional and the local level. I think the intervention by Mr. Sitek about the kind of ambition that they're seeing in their region, these are the kinds of things that a lot of analysis being done, a lot of good planning going into it, sometimes going beyond what's being done at the national level. And these kinds of things should feed into these national plans. So it's not translating a long-term objective can be difficult when you think about the short-term policy making, and hence involving all the levels is very important. I do take the note that this happens to different degree in the different member states, but in a way I think we have the framework in place, and it's a kind of a matter of implementing it and ensuring that we talk more and more to each other. In terms of the NECPs, I think one element is that a new update of these NECPs is coming up. Member states already prepared their plans in 2020, but this is not a static process. It's supposed to be an iterative one, where over time these plans are updated, and the next year they have to submit updated plans in a draft form, and then they're submitted in a final form in 2024. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to discuss and to assess how things are going. In these updates of the plans, some elements that I think will be important for the Commission, of course, is that they reflect the new ambition on Fit for 55 and the common goal towards which we are all going. At the same time, of course, with the current geopolitical situation, we've heard a lot about Repower EU, which is the plan that the Commission will publish in May to reduce our dependency, and also to fast track the types of investments that would implement the Green Deal, but also help us to increase our energy security. And then member states have also done a lot of, together with regions, these territorial just transition plans. So these are under the Just Transition Fund. They have to create exactly for regions with more carbon intensity, they have to create plans on how exactly they can benefit from the transition. And since these plans have been done after the initial NECPs, I think the kind of analysis, again, that feeds into these territorial plans should definitely be consistent and implemented, then put forward by the member states in the NECPs. So I think I leave it at that. Thank you.
Molt bé, moltes gràcies, senyora Natxeva. Donem pas ara...
All right, thank you, Ms. Nacheva. And we're now moving on to questions from the audience. I don't know if you have any questions from the audience that are present here today.
Si no, donarem pas...
Yes, I wanted to say something to Mr. Gianluca Spinacci, because I think he said something really interesting, which comes to the transnational aspect, because there's a lot of room for maneuver there. There's a lot of experiences that we need to share, but we also need the tools to do that, because right now at the European Parliament level, it's completely stalled. The option of having a mechanism that allows us to have this transnational action. And it's precisely the Spanish state that is avoiding, that is keeping this from moving forward. And this is bringing a lot of distortions when it comes to acting, because we have really exciting plans at the regional or the Pyrenees or the Mediterranean region. And we've been talking lately about a macro region, which is a hugely interesting matter, but we need the tools to do that. And we were talking earlier about matters on the ground, because Catalonia has the first transfrontier hospital in Europe, not in the Mediterranean region, in Europe. And because of the complete lack of efficiency in the communication channels, this is not moving forward. And for reasons as absurd as acknowledging where the ownership of this and that is, and managing matters, because we have to go through the Spanish state. And I will take this chance to say something that Gianluca Spinacci was saying. He was talking about France as a very centralistic state, and I would give it some nuance, because it is obviously a very centralized state. But at the end of the day, the cohesion funds for the French regions, they're being handled directly with the Commission. Whereas we, living in a supposedly more decentralized state than France, don't have that handling authority. So any French regions which has less competence is transferred to it is. So these are all things that talk about this implementation of these measures. And I quoted this lack of payments, because defaulting in payment, all these measures that affect regional areas, well, that default in payment in the Spanish economy affects European economy as a whole. And there should be an instrument that prevents that these companies that don't pay go and ask for funds to Europe, because I think these things need to be set into this specific context regionally. Because all the things that are being handled better at the regional level and that are shared with our European regions will be benefiting Europe as a whole and the citizens of Europe as a whole, if we really believe in this European common project. I don't know if Mr. Spinacci has a response. I totally agree. And I'm not just saying that, I am convinced. All right, so we have a question from the audience. Yes, if you could introduce yourself. Hello, good morning.
I'm Hannah Abdullah. I'm with CDOP, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and I work for the Global Cities program at CDOP. We've talked a lot about regional governments, but we haven't mentioned local governments and cities very much so far. And I have perhaps more comment than a question on this. So over the past decade, cities have very much sort of attained the status of pioneers of climate action, right? They've been seen as innovators, as experimenters, etc. And the EU has also reacted to this and also demonstrated that it recognizes this leadership role of cities. So last year it launched the 100 Climate Neutral Cities initiative. So this is a program that supports or aims to support 100 European cities to become climate neutral by 2030, so leading on the European Green Deal. And here cities are sort of treated as laboratories for innovation and experimentation. And this is great, and we do really need this, but what we also need is more support for upscaling and outscaling the many innovations that cities are working on and putting in place. It's not enough just for 100 European cities to become climate neutral, but we also need more medium-sized cities, smaller cities, etc., to be sort of taken on board. So And this upscaling and outscaling really requires more multi-level processes, more coordination with cities and well, between national, regional and local levels of government, and also crucially, more direct financial flows. So when the Green Deal was launched, there was also a coalition of mayors, actually led by the mayors of the Visegrad states, the Pact of Free Cities, that demanded for 10% of the European Green Deal budget to be directly given directly to cities. And so far, not much has happened on this. Thanks.
Hi ha una altra pregunta aquí des del públic?
I have another question from the audience. Good morning, thank you. I'm Gracia Vara from the European Institute of Public Administration in the Netherlands.
I'd like to make an open comment and perhaps a question to my dear friend Gianluca Spinacci. The Committee of the Regions has been, let's say, concentrating the claims for real multi-level governance from an institutional point of view historically. And for the ones who have been working like me for many years already in these topics, I would like to recall the times when you published the White Book on multi-level governance, that you launched the initiative to make a scoreboard on multi-level governance, in which we did a study, our institute made a study on how multi-level governance was working in reality. So we were having certain texts that in words, multi-level governance should be respected and defended by everybody, but in reality, we found in our conclusions that sometimes that was not fully right. And then we were analyzing which regions, cities, states, but also the European institutions, whether they were very respectful and active in defending the role of multi-level governance. So my question, listening to Mr. Gorka Nor, I would like to bring that back. Maybe it would be interesting to make an analysis on how multi-level governance is working on the ground, the reasons behind it, the effects, the impacts on it. Perhaps the Committee of the Regions could take the lead in this kind of initiative, whether the European institutions, the European Parliament, the European Commission is really working in a multi-level governance on the ground mood. I know this is a bit provocative, but I just wanted to bring this up. Thank you very much.
No, cap provocació. Jo estic completament d'acord. De fet,
Oh, no provocation at all. I completely agree. And there are already several initiatives surrounding this, and we ought to go a little deeper into what you were saying. And as Gianluca Spinacci, if I understood it correctly, one of the three axes that he mentioned was precisely that. To incorporate what is happening on the ground and aggregate all these data to know exactly what is going on. And in that sense, not just about that, but we're seeing some really interesting trends when it comes to the Committee of the Regions. Some of us were rather reluctant to have this committee. Many years ago, I remember years ago, I was a member of the European Parliament between 1999 and 2000. So I've been through the failure of the Treaty of Nice and thoughts on the future of Europe. And we're now talking about the future of Europe, but this is a conversation we had in the past. So the titles are changing, but the subject matter remains the same. And back then, many of us from different ideologies were rather reluctant when it comes to the role of the region, because we thought, oh, okay, so a committee has been done, so we don't tackle this subject. So we just construct this institution to keep it from bothering anyone else. And I think this was a feeling that many people shared. But today, paradoxically, I believe that what's happening, at least those of us who are in Brussels on a daily basis, we have the notion that the Committee of the Regions is right now taking on a really important role, and that new politicians are really taking seriously this role of influencing and communicating with the regions, because they understand that this is a historic moment for regions and European local institutions. Yes, there's been a comment about cities, which is also an interesting discussion. But I believe that in this historic moment right now, if we all row in the same direction from different regions and territories in Europe, we will achieve that the Committee of Regions and the multi-level governance in Europe as a whole takes on a new dimension, a new speed to really influence decisions at the European level. At least that is my feeling. Maybe I'm just dreaming here. Okay. So we will be welcoming Laura Foreste, General Secretary of DIPLOCAT, to say the closing words. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, good morning, everyone. And first of all, just really briefly, I just wanted to tell you what DIPLOCAT is doing here, what they're doing in organizing this seminar today. And I'll be very, very brief before I offer the closing remarks. Just very briefly, DIPLOCAT within the strategic plan defines the work that we do, which is international dialogue, connecting, projecting, and enabling. We work in order to build bridges. This is what we're always explaining, between Catalonia and the rest of the world, that we want to be durable. And through these bridges, we want people, projects, and ideas to circulate. At the same time, we also want to foster the education when it comes to the civil society, and as well as the members of the consortium. And it is precisely in a debate such as today about multi-level governance and green transition, where we believe that what we do completely ties in with these goals, because today we established new connections, we projected an image of the country, or what we want to prove, because we want to prove for current situations. And at a certain point, we want to enable, we do this part of training, because we all know a little bit about multi-level governance than we did at the start of the session. We know that DIPLOCAT is a long-standing consortium. It was built in 1992, because when it was first built, it already had a very deep European roots, as well as this consortial and plural aspect, because we today are liaising with 38 different public institutions in Catalonia, as well as the Catalan government, universities, business schools, and other companies, sports institutions, social associations. So we do know a little bit about this multi-level. We work with and for several of these institutions in different aspects. And in this case, we went hand in hand with the Catalan delegation before the European Union. Today, we were able to talk and listen to experts in multi-level governance who have told us about the role that they play in the decision-making process at the European Union, and how every administrative action ensures a successful green transition for the European Union. To all our speakers and participants, thank you. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for coming in and sharing your experience and knowledge. And I would also like to extend our thanks to the DIPLOCAT and the Catalan government teams. And just to summarize a little bit what has been said, the General Director, Gerard Vives, he highlighted that the Next Generation funds are the largest stimulus package ever funded in this continent. And the sub-state authorities, even though according to the multi-level governance system, are together with city halls and local, the closest institutions to the citizens and those that know the best the reality on the ground, haven't seen their voices heard in this occasion. And that was what the General Director was lamenting. On the other hand, the European Pact, Green Pact from the Government of Catalonia, we want the Green Revolution to be successful. And for that, it needs to reach the local and regional levels to ensure that economic growth comes hand in hand with the use of resources and that no part of the territory is left behind. Our keynote speaker, Philip De Lombard, talked to us about multi-level governance and other concepts that are closely linked to it, such as the principle of subsidiarity or the multi-stakeholderism, talking about the different agents that participate in the decision-making part of public policies. He gave us the recommendations for the Conference of the Future of Europe, Climate Change, Environment and Health. And he mentioned that not many mentions to multi-level governance are made, but they do appear in the contributions of the Committee of the Regions. There are also references to citizens' participation, but he did highlight the difference because it's not the same. One thing is not the same as the other. Keeping in mind that climate challenges do demand strong policies at all levels, multi-level governance is absolute. We can't absolutely do without it. And he finished his speech wondering about the impact of the Conference on the Future of Europe and pointing at the fact that maybe it will end up bringing a reform of the treaty for the European Union or a two-speed European Union. During the roundtable, we were able to find out about the meaning of several institutions that participate in the decision-making and the policies from the European administration to the regions. In that sense, Svetlana Sheva from the European Commission mentioned that there are many challenges ahead that will bring a great transformation. So all kind of support and implication at different levels is needed. And for that, they organize discussions and surveys, but they do need this implication to make sure that these policies are implemented. And to guarantee its success, we also must guarantee that the budget of the European Union is actually invested in environmental policies. Mr. Maciej Sisek from the Polish region mentioned how multi-level governance in the frame of green transition can construct a new identity based on different ways of doing to guarantee a fair transition. In that sense, East Wielkopolska has set very ambitious goals with regards to their climate transition and its implementation. In their particular case, it's a transformation of mining regions that have important challenges ahead of them beyond the decisions taken by the states, which as he said, it often involves going against the current. To fulfill their goals, they think that it's important to be able to act freely, that the regions be able to act freely, as well as participation from intermediate territorial institutions and a state collaboration with different institutions at the national and international level, fostering multi-level governance without forgetting wide social participation, because it's a way of learning and exchanging best practices and to be more swift and efficient in achieving these goals. Afterwards, Gianluca Spinacci from the Committee of the Regions highlighted the importance that will have for the future of the European Union's the commitment of involving citizens at the different administrative levels. It's crucial to make them feel part of the European project. And he gave the example that we've all seen and experienced with the refugee crisis from Ukraine. How important was the participation of these different actors from cities to the highest supranational levels at the European Union when it came to fostering and taking in these refugees. He also highlighted that the European Union is created by states and administrative institutions that have to be involved and are part and be a part of the European processes. This has been the case with the two projects that have been deployed with regards to green transition, where different cities, states, and regions are participating. And I believe he also highlighted, and that's what everyone would wish to happen, that the European Committee of the Regions must be an enabler for this, to ensure that this multi-level governance be effective, and that we need to look ahead and look for the roles, the right roles and instruments to make regions and cities be part of the decision-making processes towards a green transition. And he gave the example of the Citizens' Initiative of Fridays for Future, where no one is doubting that citizens' voices must be heard anymore. I'm sorry, I just have so much to say that I just keep going back and forth. He also said that with regards to the conference on the future of Europe, citizens see that they're expressing wishes on the European Union that they want. And now we need the second part. How will the institutions answer to these wishes? And finally, last but not least, our delegate from the government before the European Union, Gorka Knör, who mentioned that multi-level governance is a concept installed at the European Union that everyone talks about, but in practice it's hard to see, or it's hard to see implemented, because it requires a real implication from the states, and some of them are reluctant due to centralization, such as we've seen with the mechanisms of cooperation and resilience. He also highlighted the importance of the Committee of the Regions right now, where we need to take into account all the participating voices. And there's the hope that is put again on the Committee of the Regions to channel these voices. He also highlighted that at the Catalan levels, we have examples of implementation of multi-level governance, to the creation of mechanisms of permanent co-handling, which is such as the Baix Empordà region and the way the coastline is handled. Because if I'm not mistaken, it implies research institutions, NGOs, companies, as well as the cities who have their activities comprised in this area. And what we've seen at the local level is that the result has been an improvement of the management with regards to the uses and activities in a protected marine area within the Natura 200 network. Examples such as these could be extrapolated to other countries of the European Union, and I'm sure that we would all be all the better for it. Both the delegate as well as the representative from the Committee of the Region have been talking about the need to share experiences with other territories, to have this exchange of best practices and experiences. And the government delegate also said that the European Union needs to go from words to action. We need to make the voice of the regions heard. And he shares the Catalan government the goal of going to the European institutions, but he believes that right now everything is sort of close to the participation of certain regional and local institutions. The representative of the Committee of the Region also mentioned the importance of cooperation, cross-national cooperation to solve certain questions. And about the last debate, I would just mention these two comments that we had on the need to get more support and elevate the innovations that may take place within cities. And from Gracia Vara, where she challenged, she said it would be interesting to see how multi-level governance is really applied on the ground. And just my closing words, my personal opinion after this whole debate is that the European strategy towards sustainable development will only work with a multi-level, effective multi-level governance. And if we apply the necessary measures to achieve the sustainability, and this multi-level governance through projects such as the Conference about the Future of Europe, I sincerely believe that this multi-level governance can only take place if we do it in a network and with responsibility. And this is it. I know that was a lot. I'm sure we'll all be going back to the recordings. Thank you so much, everyone, to our speakers, to the audience, to everyone who's been following on the streaming broadcast, and hopefully we'll get to meet again.
Moltes gràcies, Laura Foraster. Abans de donar per acabada la sessió...
Thank you, Laura Foraster. Before we close today's sessions, we thank for everyone for being here today, as well, obviously, our four speakers, Tetiana Mateva, Matej Sitek, Gianluca Spinacci, and Gorka Knör, Mr. Gerald Vivas Fernandez, General Director of Institutional Communication between the government and the European Union, and Dr. Philip De Lombard. Thank you very much for being here today in this session on multi-governance. Thank you for making it so interesting. So we're closing the session. Have a lovely day. Thank you.